I thought the hardest part about trying to conceive would be the medical procedures, the hormone injections, the emotional roller coaster of hope and disappointment month after month. I never imagined the real challenge would be sitting in a fertility clinic waiting room, watching my husband of 8 years hold hands with his secretary while I waited alone for the doctor to discuss our treatment options. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That moment shattered more than just my trust. It destroyed the carefully constructed life I thought we were building together. But here's what David and his precious Ashley didn't anticipate. When you humiliate a woman who's spent 8 years building a successful marketing empire from the ground up, you better be prepared for the kind of strategic response that comes with years of experience in crushing the competition. The morning everything started to unravel began like any other Tuesday in our Ahwatukee home. I was reviewing client presentations for Rodriguez and Associates while David rushed around the kitchen, grabbing his coffee and checking emails on his phone. After 8 years of marriage, we had fallen into this comfortable routine where conversations happened in passing glances and quick updates about schedules. He worked late most nights at Chen & Sullivan Legal Group, handling corporate real estate deals that seemed to consume more and more of his attention. I understood the demands of building a career. My marketing firm had grown from a one-woman operation in our spare bedroom to a downtown Phoenix office with 12 employees and clients across 3 states. What I didn't understand was why Ashley Williams had become such a central figure in our personal life over the past 6 months. David had hired her as his secretary when his previous assistant retired, and initially I was grateful someone competent was helping manage his chaotic schedule. Ashley was efficient, professional, and seemed to anticipate his needs before he even voiced them. She scheduled his meetings, managed his client files, and even began handling some of his personal appointments when his workload became overwhelming. The first time I met Ashley was at the firm's summer barbecue. She was younger than I expected, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of careful attention to detail. Her handshake was firm, her smile warm, and she spoke knowledgeably about the firm's recent cases. David introduced her with obvious pride, mentioning how she had streamlined their filing system and improved client communication. I liked her immediately, which makes what happened later so much more painful to process. As the months passed, Ashley's involvement in David's professional life expanded naturally. She began staying late to help with complex cases, accompanying him to client meetings to take detailed notes, and even joining him for business dinners when important deals required evening negotiation. David would come home energized by these productive sessions, praising Ashley's insights and dedication. He seemed happier at work than he had in years, and I genuinely celebrated his professional satisfaction. The shift happened so gradually that I didn't recognize it at first. David started mentioning Ashley's opinions on everything from restaurant choices to vacation destinations. When I suggested we try the new Italian place downtown, he would counter with Ashley's recommendation for the tapas bar she had discovered. When I proposed a weekend trip to Sedona, he mentioned that Ashley thought we would enjoy the wine country near Flagstaff instead. These weren't major disagreements, just small redirections that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively began to feel like my preferences were being filtered through someone else's judgment. Our fertility journey had been ongoing for 2 years by this point. We had progressed from basic testing to more advanced treatments, each step requiring careful coordination of appointments, medications, and procedures. The emotional toll was significant, but I remained optimistic that persistence would eventually lead to success. David seemed supportive during the early stages, attending most appointments and asking thoughtful questions about treatment options. However, as the process became more complex and time-consuming, his participation became increasingly sporadic. The first appointment David missed was for a routine consultation about adjusting my hormone protocol. He had an unexpected client meeting that ran long, and Ashley called to apologize on his behalf, explaining that the case required immediate attention. I understood completely. Business emergencies happen, and rescheduling client meetings can be complicated. Ashley was thoughtful enough to ask if I needed anything, and offered to have David call me as soon as his meeting concluded. The second missed appointment was for test results that would determine our next treatment phase. This time, David was attending a deposition that had been scheduled months in advance, And again, Ashley called to express his regret. She had taken the initiative to research the clinic's policies about having results explained over the phone, ensuring David could stay informed even though he couldn't be present. Her attention to our situation felt caring and supportive. By the third missed appointment, a pattern had emerged, but I convinced myself it was coincidental. David's work demands were intense, and the timing of medical appointments didn't always align with his professional obligation. Ashley continued to serve as our communication liaison, keeping David updated on my treatments, and even researching fertility support resources online. She sent me thoughtful articles about nutrition during IVF and stress management techniques that other couples had found helpful. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's secretary was more involved in our fertility journey than David himself. Ashley knew my medication schedule, understood the timing of procedures, and could explain the treatment protocol better than my husband could. When friends asked about our progress, David would often defer to details that Ashley had provided, since she maintained better records of our appointments than either of us did. I began to appreciate Ashley's organizational skills and genuine concern for our situation. She seemed invested in our success in a way that felt authentic rather than merely professional. When I had to cancel a client meeting for an unexpected monitoring appointment, Ashley coordinated with David's schedule to ensure someone could drive me home if I felt uncomfortable after the procedure. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the treatment timeline, Ashley created a color-coded calendar that tracked everything from medication administration to appointment reminder. The gradual nature of Ashley's integration into our personal life made each step feel logical and helpful. She wasn't inserting herself into our marriage. She was providing support that David's demanding schedule prevented him from offering directly. At least, that's how I rationalized the situation during those months when red flags were accumulating. But I was too focused on achieving pregnancy to examine the underlying dynamics carefully. David's appreciation for Ashley extended beyond her professional capability. He frequently mentioned her thoughtfulness, her intelligence, her ability to anticipate needs before they arose. During dinner conversations, Ashley's name appeared with increasing frequency. She had suggested the perfect gift for his mother's birthday. She had identified a more efficient route to avoid traffic during his commute. She had recommended a book that had changed his perspective on client relations. These weren't romantic revelations, but they represented a level of personal attention and insight that I realized David hadn't sought from me in quite some time. The fertility treatments were affecting my energy levels and emotional stability in ways that made maintaining my usual productivity challenging. Some days, the hormone injections left me feeling exhausted and irritable. Other days, the anticipation of test results created anxiety that made concentrating on work nearly impossible. David seemed to understand these fluctuations intellectually, but his practical response was often to suggest that Ashley could help coordinate whatever I needed. If I was too tired to cook dinner, Ashley knew excellent takeout options. If I needed someone to drive me to an appointment, Ashley could adjust David's schedule to accommodate the timing. I started to feel like Ashley was becoming a proxy for David's involvement in our marriage. Rather than him learning to navigate my changing needs directly, he outsourced that emotional labor to someone who was already managing every other aspect of his daily life. The arrangement felt efficient and practical, but something essential was being lost in the process. David and I were connecting less frequently and less meaningfully, with Ashley serving as an intermediary for communication that should have been happening between us directly. Our intimate life had also shifted during this period, though I attributed most changes to the medical requirements of fertility treatment. Scheduled intercourse replaced spontaneous connection. Hormone fluctuations affected my desire and energy. The clinical nature of conception began to overshadow the romantic aspects of our relationship. David seemed understanding about these temporary adjustments, but I noticed he was staying later at work more frequently and spending more time on weekend business calls with clients who apparently needed immediate attention. The weekend before everything exploded, David spent Saturday afternoon at the office working on a complex acquisition that required Ashley's assistance with document preparation. He returned home energized and talkative, describing the intricate details of the deal and praising Ashley's ability to organize massive amounts of information efficiently. He mentioned that they had ordered dinner from the Greek restaurant I had been wanting to try, and Ashley had insisted they get extra food so David could bring some home for me. The gesture felt thoughtful, but something about receiving my dinner as a secondary consideration rather than being invited to join them left me feeling oddly excluded. Sunday morning, David received a call from Ashley about a client emergency that required immediate attention. She had already contacted the client, reviewed the relevant files, and identified the specific legal precedents they needed to address. David was impressed by her proactive response and spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table working through solutions while staying in constant phone contact with Ashley. I watched him become animated and engaged in a way that I hadn't seen him direct toward our conversations in months. That afternoon, while David napped after his intensive work session, I found myself wondering when Ashley had become so central to his professional satisfaction and personal well-being. She wasn't just doing her job, she was enhancing his life in ways that made him more confident, more productive, and more fulfilled. I felt grateful that he had such excellent support, but I also felt a growing sense of displacement that I couldn't quite articulate. The appointment that changed everything was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 in the morning. We were meeting with Dr. Martinez to discuss the results of my latest tests and determine whether to proceed with our next IVF cycle or explore alternative approach. David had confirmed his attendance multiple times, emphasizing how important this decision was for our future. I felt optimistic about his commitment to being present for such a crucial conversation. Monday evening, David mentioned that Ashley would be joining us at the appointment. He explained that she had been tracking all our fertility information and could provide detailed records that might help Dr. Martinez understand our complete treatment history. She had also researched questions we should ask about success rates, potential complications, and alternative protocol. Her preparation would ensure we didn't miss any important considerations during our consultation. I felt surprised by this suggestion but couldn't immediately identify why it bothered me. Ashley had indeed been more organized about our medical journey than either David or I had been. Having comprehensive records and well-researched questions would probably improve the quality of our consultation. David presented her attendance as a practical advantage that would benefit our decision-making process. However, something felt fundamentally wrong about including Ashley in such an intimate medical discussion. These appointments involve deeply personal conversations about our bodies, our relationship, our hopes for creating a family together. The presence of David's secretary, regardless of her helpfulness and good intentions, seemed to cross a boundary that I couldn't clearly define but instinctively felt was important. When I tried to express my discomfort, David seemed genuinely puzzled by my objection. Ashley had been involved in coordinating our appointments for months. She understood our situation better than most of our friends and family members did. Her presence would be professional and discreet, focused solely on ensuring we had accurate information for making informed decisions. He couldn't understand why I would want to exclude someone who had been so supportive of our journey. His inability to comprehend my perspective felt more disturbing than his original suggestion. The fact that David couldn't immediately recognize why I might want privacy during intimate medical consultations suggested a fundamental disconnect in how we viewed our marriage, our boundaries, and our shared experience. I agreed to Ashley's attendance because I couldn't articulate my objections in a way that seemed rational rather than emotional, but I spent Monday night feeling increasingly uneasy about Tuesday's appointment. Tuesday morning arrived with the usual Phoenix sunshine and clear skies that made every day feel full of possibility. I dressed carefully for the appointment, choosing clothes that made me feel confident and comfortable. David seemed relaxed and optimistic, mentioning that Ashley had prepared a folder with all our relevant documents and a list of strategic questions that would help us evaluate our options comprehensively. We arrived at the Scottsdale Fertility Clinic 15 minutes early and Ashley was already waiting in the parking lot, perfectly dressed and carrying a professional-looking portfolio. She greeted us warmly, expressing hope that today's consultation would provide the clarity we needed to move forward confidently. Her manner was appropriate and supportive, exactly what I should have wanted from someone attending such an important appointment. But as we walked into the clinic together, I felt like I was attending my own medical consultation as a third party rather than the primary patient. David and Ashley walked slightly ahead, discussing the questions they wanted to prioritize and the information they hoped to obtain. I followed behind, feeling increasingly disconnected from a process that was supposedly centered on my body and our shared dreams of starting a family. The waiting room scene that followed would become burned into my memory as the moment when my carefully constructed life began to crumble, revealing truths that I had been unconsciously avoiding for months, but could no longer ignore. The waiting room at the fertility clinic buzzed with the quiet tension that medical facilities seem to cultivate. Couples sat in carefully spaced chairs, some holding hands, others absorbed in their phones, all sharing the unspoken bond of hope, mixed with anxiety that comes with seeking help to create life. I had been in this room dozens of times over the past 2 years, but today felt different in a way that made my skin crawl with unease. David and Ashley had chosen seats directly across from the reception desk, positioning themselves to have clear sightlines to the hallway where nurses would eventually call my name. They sat closer together than necessary, their heads bent over the portfolio Ashley had prepared, voices low but animated as they reviewed their carefully organized material. Occasionally, one of them would gesture toward a document, and the other would nod with understanding, their coordination seamless and practiced. I selected a chair several feet away, ostensibly to give them space to work, but really because I couldn't bear to sit beside them while they discussed my medical treatment, like it was a business transaction they were preparing to negotiate. The physical distance felt symbolic of something larger that I was only beginning to recognize. When had I become an observer in my own fertility journey? When had David and Ashley become the primary stakeholders in decisions about my body and our future? Ashley had dressed impeccably for the occasion, wearing a tailored navy blazer over a cream-colored blouse that projected professional competence while remaining appropriate for a medical setting. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged in important meetings. She looked more like David's business partner than his employee, and certainly more prepared for this appointment than I felt despite being the actual patient. David seemed energized by Ashley's presence in a way that made my stomach clench with recognition. This was how he looked during successful client meetings, or when closing complex deals. His posture was alert and engaged, his expressions animated as he processed information and formulated strategy. I realized with growing horror that he was approaching our fertility consultation with the same professional detachment he brought to corporate negotiations, with Ashley serving as his trusted advisor and me relegated to the role of client whose needs required management. The portfolio Ashley had prepared was impressive in its thoroughness. She had compiled copies of all my test results, organized chronologically with color-coded tabs for easy reference. She had researched statistics about IVF success rates for women in my age group and demographic profile. She had prepared questions about alternative treatment protocols, potential medication adjustments, and timeline considerations for future cycles. Her preparation was more comprehensive than anything David or I had ever done independently. But watching them work together, I felt increasingly displaced from my own medical care. They were discussing my hormone levels, my egg quality, my uterine lining thickness, like they were reviewing market research data for a product launch. Their clinical approach stripped away the emotional weight and personal significance of these factors, reducing my reproductive capacity to variables in an optimization problem they were determined to solve efficiently. Other couples in the waiting room seemed to exist in their own private bubbles of shared anxiety and mutual support. I watched a woman reach for her partner's hand as they waited, saw him squeeze back reassuringly. Another couple whispered quietly to each other, the man stroking his wife's shoulder as she leaned against him. The intimacy of these moments highlighted how isolated I felt sitting apart from David and Ashley while they conducted what appeared to be a business meeting about my fertility. The nurse who called my name was someone I had worked with before, a warm woman named Sandra, who always remembered personal details about my treatment and asked thoughtful questions about how I was managing the emotional aspects of the process. She glanced at David and Ashley as they stood to follow us, her expression slightly puzzled but professionally neutral. Most patients attended these appointments alone or with their partners, and the presence of a third party clearly struck her as unusual. As we walked in the hallway toward Dr. Martinez's office, I found myself trailing behind David and Ashley again. They continued their quiet conversation about strategic questions and information priorities, their professional dynamic so natural and well established that they seemed to forget I was present. Sandra slowed her pace to walk beside me, asking quietly how I was feeling and whether I had any specific concerns about today's appointment. Her attention felt like a lifeline, reminding me that this was supposed to be about my health and my choices. Dr. Martinez's office was spacious and comfortable, designed to facilitate difficult conversations about sensitive topics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had been our fertility specialist for over a year, and I appreciated his direct communication style and his respect for the emotional complexity of our situation. He greeted David and me warmly, then looked questioningly at Ashley as we settled into chairs arranged around his desk. David immediately introduced Ashley as his assistant, who had been helping coordinate our appointments and maintain records of my treatment. He explained that she had prepared comprehensive materials that would help ensure we covered all relevant topics during our consultation. Dr. Martinez nodded politely, though I noticed his attention remained focused primarily on David and me as the actual patients involved in treatment decisions. Ashley opened her portfolio and began presenting our medical history with remarkable accuracy and detail. She had documented every appointment, every medication adjustment, every test result with the precision of someone who had been personally involved in each step of the process. Her presentation was so thorough that Dr. Martinez complimented the quality of her record-keeping and mentioned that most patients didn't maintain such organized documentation. But as Ashley continued to speak, using phrases like our timeline and our treatment goals and our concerns about success rates, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. These weren't her timelines or goals or concerns. This was my body, my reproductive system, my emotional journey through months of invasive procedures and hormonal treatments. Yet somehow, Ashley had positioned herself as an equal stakeholder in decisions that should have been intensely personal between David and me. Dr. Martinez began discussing my latest test results, explaining that my hormone levels had responded well to the current protocol but that we might benefit from adjusting the timing of certain medications in future cycles. He spoke directly to me, asking about my experience with side effects and my comfort level with continuing the current approach versus exploring alternatives. His questions required personal insights that only I could provide, and for the first time since entering his office, I felt like the primary participant in my own medical care. However, when Dr. Martinez asked about our emotional readiness for another IVF cycle, David immediately deferred to Ashley's research about stress management and support resources. When he inquired about our financial capacity for additional treatments, David again referenced information that Ashley had compiled about insurance coverage and payment options. Ashley had become David's external brain for processing every aspect of our fertility journey, leaving him unable to engage with the personal dimensions of our situation without consulting her expertise. The most disturbing moment came when Dr. Martinez about our relationship dynamics and how we were supporting each other through the emotional challenges of fertility treatment. David responded by praising Ashley's ability to keep us organized and informed, completely missing the intent of the question. Dr. Martinez clarified that he was asking about communication between David and me, about how we were maintaining intimacy and connection while navigating medical stress. David looked genuinely confused, as if the idea of focusing on our marriage separately from efficient medical management had never occurred to him. Ashley attempted to redirect the conversation back to clinical considerations, asking about success rate statistics and timeline expectations for future cycles. Her questions were intelligent and well-researched, but they avoided the emotional and relational aspects of fertility treatment that Dr. Martinez clearly considered important factors in treatment planning. She was treating our consultation like a medical data gathering session rather than a holistic discussion about our readiness to continue a challenging and invasive process. I watched David's face as Ashley asked her prepared questions, noting how he nodded approvingly at each point and occasionally added supporting details that reinforced her inquiries. They were functioning as a team, presenting a united front in their approach to managing my medical care. But I wasn't part of their team. I was the subject of their management, the patient whose treatment they were collaboratively optimizing. When Dr. Martinez suggested that David and I might benefit from counseling to address the emotional strain of extended fertility treatment, Ashley immediately volunteered to research therapists who specialized in reproductive psychology. She offered to coordinate scheduling and compile information about therapeutic approaches that other couples had found helpful. Her willingness to insert herself into even the most intimate aspects of our relationship felt like a boundary violation so profound that I struggled to process its implications. David seemed oblivious to the inappropriate nature of Ashley's involvement in our personal therapy discussion. He thanked her for her proactive approach and mentioned that her organizational skills would probably help us find the right counselor more efficiently than we could manage on our own. The ease with which he outsourced our emotional well-being to his secretary suggested a level of disconnection from our marriage that I was only beginning to comprehend. Dr. Martinez wrapped up our consultation by recommending that we take a few weeks to consider our options before committing to another IVF cycle. He emphasized the importance of ensuring that both partners felt emotionally prepared for the demands of continued treatment. He handed me informational materials about stress reduction techniques and support group resources, addressing his recommendations directly to me, as the patient who would be undergoing physical procedures. As we prepared to leave his office, Ashley thanked Dr. Martinez for his time and assured him that she would follow up with any additional questions that might arise after we reviewed his recommendations. She spoke with the authority of someone who expected to remain involved in ongoing treatment decisions, and Martinez looked slightly uncomfortable with her assumption of continued participation in our private medical care. Walking back through the clinic hallway, I felt like I was sleepwalking through someone else's life. David and Ashley continued their debriefing conversation, analyzing Martinez's recommendations and planning next steps for our treatment timeline. They discussed medication options, scheduling considerations, and research priorities with the efficiency of colleagues, wrapping up a successful business meeting. In the parking lot, Ashley presented David with a typed summary of action items from our appointment, complete with deadlines and responsibility assignments. She had somehow taken notes during Dr. Martinez's presentation while simultaneously participating in the discussion, demonstrating a level of multitasking that would have been impressive in any other context. David reviewed her summary with obvious appreciation, praising her ability to capture essential information while they were both focused on asking questions. I stood beside my own car, keys in hand, watching my husband and his secretary coordinate follow-up activities for my fertility treatment, like I was a project they were managing, rather than a person making deeply personal medical decisions. The surreal nature of the situation made me question whether I was overreacting to what might have been intended as helpful support. Maybe Ashley's involvement was genuinely beneficial. Maybe David's reliance on her organizational skills was practical rather than problematic. But deep in my chest, a cold certainty was crystallizing that had nothing to do with rational analysis of Ashley's helpfulness. David had brought another woman to the most intimate medical appointment of our marriage. He had allowed her to speak for us, plan for us, and position herself as an equal stakeholder in decisions about our future family. Whether intentionally or unconsciously, he had replaced me with Ashley as his primary partner in navigating our fertility journey. The drive home passed in silence, broken only by David's phone conversations with Ashley about scheduling our next step. He called her twice during the 20-minute trip, once to clarify a detail about insurance authorization, and once to discuss timing for the counseling appointments she was researching. Each conversation reinforced my growing realization that Ashley had become more integrated into David's daily life than I was, despite being his wife for 8 years. That evening, David worked late at the office again, staying to help Ashley compile additional research about fertility treatment options. He texted me updates about their progress and mentioned that Ashley had identified several promising approaches we hadn't previously considered. His messages were informative and considerate, keeping me involved in their research efforts while I stayed home alone, processing the day's events, and trying to understand why I felt so profoundly violated by what everyone else seemed to consider helpful support. I spent Tuesday night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction from the clinic appointment. The more I analyzed what had happened, the clearer it became that David and Ashley had crossed boundaries that went far beyond professional assistance or friendly support. They had assumed joint authority over my medical care, spoken for my preferences, and planned my treatment timeline without consulting my actual desires or concerns. But the boundary violations at the clinic were symptoms of a larger problem that I was finally ready to acknowledge. David had been gradually replacing me with Ashley as his primary emotional and intellectual partner. She understood his work better than I did. She anticipated his needs more effectively than I could. She shared his daily experiences and challenges in ways that my own career and responsibilities prevented me from doing. Ashley hadn't stolen my husband through seduction or manipulation. She had simply become a better version of the partner David wanted than I was capable of being while maintaining my own identity and career. The evolution had been so gradual and practical that David probably didn't recognize what had happened. But sitting in that clinic waiting room, watching them function as a seamless team while I observed from the sidelines, the reality became impossible to ignore. David had chosen Ashley over me in every way that mattered except the legal paperwork. She was his intellectual equal, his professional companion, his trusted advisor, and his emotional confidant. I had become the wife who provided domestic stability and social respectability while Ashley fulfilled all the roles that actually engaged David's attention and affection. Wednesday morning brought clarity that felt both devastating and liberating. I woke up knowing exactly what I needed to do, not from anger or jealousy, but from a deep recognition that my marriage had already ended. David and Ashley had built a partnership that excluded me in every meaningful way. The only question remaining was whether I would continue pretending otherwise, or acknowledge the truth and act accordingly. I spent Wednesday morning at my office, handling client meetings and strategic planning sessions with the focused intensity that had built Rodriguez and Associates into one of Phoenix's most successful marketing firms. Work provided a refuge where my competence and judgment were respected, where my opinions carried weight, and where I functioned as the primary decision-maker rather than a peripheral observer of my own life. During my lunch break, I drove to Jennifer Hayes's law office downtown. Jennifer and I had known each other since college, and her family law practice had earned respect throughout Phoenix for handling high-profile divorce cases with discretion and strategic sophistication. I had never imagined needing her professional services, but Tuesday's clinic appointment had stripped away illusions I couldn't afford to maintain any longer. Jennifer listened to my situation without judgment or surprise, taking notes as I described the gradual evolution of David and Ashley's relationship and the boundary violations that had culminated in yesterday's fertility appointment. She asked pointed questions about our financial arrangements, property ownership, and documentation of Ashley's involvement in our personal affairs. Her professional demeanor helped me process the situation objectively rather than getting lost in emotional reactions that would cloud my judgment. By Thursday afternoon, Jennifer had prepared divorce papers that protected my interests while offering David terms that were fair given our respective contributions to the marriage. We had built separate financial portfolios during our 8 years together, which simplified property division considerably. My marketing firm was entirely my own creation, developed before our marriage and grown through my independent effort. David's law practice was similarly his individual achievement, though I had provided emotional and practical support during its establishment. The divorce documents Jennifer prepared were comprehensive, but not punitive. I wanted to end our marriage cleanly rather than engaging in prolonged legal battles that would benefit no one except attorneys. David could keep his law practice, his clients, and his partnership with Mark Sullivan. He could continue his professional relationship with Ashley without interference from me. I simply wanted out of a marriage that had become irrelevant to my husband's actual life. Friday morning, I dressed with particular care, choosing a charcoal gray suit that projected competence and authority. I wanted to look like the successful businesswoman I had become, not like the displaced wife I had felt like during Tuesday's clinic appointment. Jennifer met me at David's office building, carrying the divorce papers in a professional portfolio that gave our mission the gravity it deserved. Chen and Sullivan Legal Group occupied the 15th floor of a downtown high-rise, with panoramic views of the Phoenix skyline and modern decor that suggested prosperity and success. I had visited David's office countless times over the years, but today I noticed details that had previously escaped my attention. Photographs of David and Ashley at various business events lined the walls of the reception area. Their professional awards and achievements were displayed together, creating the impression of equal partnership rather than employer-employee hierarchy. Ashley greeted us at the reception desk with professional courtesy that shifted to concern when she recognized me. She asked whether David was expecting us and offered to check his calendar for availability. Her manner was perfectly appropriate, but I noticed how naturally she assumed authority over access to David's time and attention. She had become the gatekeeper to my own husband's availability. Jennifer handled the interaction with smooth professionalism, explaining that we needed to speak with David about urgent legal matters that required immediate attention. Ashley hesitated, clearly torn between her protective instincts regarding David's schedule and her uncertainty about the nature of our business. She offered to interrupt his current meeting if the matter was truly time-sensitive. David emerged from his office a few minutes later, looking puzzled but pleased to see me. He greeted Jennifer warmly, remembering her from social events we had attended together over the year. He invited us into his office, assuming we needed legal advice about some aspect of my business, or perhaps matters related to our fertility treatment. His assumption that I would naturally turn to him for professional guidance felt ironic given what I was about to deliver. His office reflected the same professional success as the reception area, with diplomas and awards arranged to showcase his achievements in corporate law. A framed photograph of us from our wedding day sat on his desk alongside more recent pictures of office events and client celebration. Ashley appeared in several of the recent photographs, her presence so integrated into David's professional life that she had become part of his visual representation of success. Jennifer placed the divorce papers on David's desk with calm efficiency, explaining that I was filing for dissolution of our marriage, and that he should review the documents with his own legal counsel before responding. David stared at the papers without touching them, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing alarm. He looked at me as if I had started speaking a foreign language, unable to process information that contradicted his assumptions about our relationship. His first response was to ask whether this was about Tuesday's appointment, whether I was upset about Ashley's involvement in our fertility consultation. He seemed genuinely bewildered by the possibility that her presence had been inappropriate, emphasizing her helpfulness and professional competence. His inability to understand my perspective confirmed that the gap between us had grown beyond any possibility of repair. When I explained that the divorce wasn't about Ashley specifically but about the fundamental changes in our marriage that her role had revealed, David became defensive and argumentative. He insisted that Ashley was simply providing professional support that made our lives easier and more organized. He couldn't understand why I would object to efficiency and competence, why I would prefer chaos and disorganization over the smooth coordination Ashley brought to our household management. His response demonstrated exactly why our marriage had become untenable. David valued Ashley's contributions to his life more than he valued my autonomy and dignity as his wife. He saw no problem with outsourcing intimate aspects of our relationship to someone whose primary loyalty was to him rather than to our marriage. He had replaced partnership with management, and he preferred the management Ashley provided over the partnership I required. The conversation that followed was brief and decisive, rather than emotional or dramatic. David asked whether counseling might address whatever problems I perceived in our relationship. I explained that counseling couldn't resolve the fundamental issue of his having chosen Ashley as his primary partner while expecting me to remain satisfied with secondary status. He protested that Ashley was his employee, not his partner, but his protest rang hollow given the reality of their daily collaboration and emotional intimacy. Jennifer maintained professional control over the meeting, preventing it from devolving into personal accusations or emotional manipulation. She outlined the timeline for David's response to the divorce filing, and provided contact information for her office to handle future communication. Her presence ensured that our marriage would end with dignity rather than descending into the kind of bitter conflict that destroys both parties. As we prepared to leave David's office, Ashley appeared in the doorway to ask whether David needed anything before his next appointment. The timing of her interruption felt symbolic, a final demonstration of how thoroughly she had integrated herself into every aspect of David's professional and personal life. She was already there to provide whatever support he might need to process this unexpected disruption to his carefully organized existence. Walking out of Chen and Sullivan Legal Group for the last time, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of pretending our marriage was functional, of accepting secondary status in my own life, of accommodating David's preference for Ashley's partnership over mine, had lifted completely. I was free to build a life centered on my own values and priorities, rather than trying to compete with someone who had already won David's attention and affection. The divorce proceedings that followed were straightforward and amicable, handled through attorneys rather than direct confrontation. David seemed to understand that fighting the dissolution would be futile and potentially damaging to his professional reputation. He signed the papers without contest, accepting terms that allowed both of us to maintain our respective careers and assets, while severing legal ties that had become irrelevant to our actual lives. 6 months later, I heard through mutual friends that David and Ashley had made their relationship official, moving in together and announcing their engagement. The news didn't surprise or hurt me. They had been functioning as partners long before I filed for divorce, and their transition from professional collaboration to personal commitment was simply an acknowledgement of existing reality rather than a betrayal of our marriage. I focused my energy on expanding Rodriguez and Associates, taking on clients and projects that challenged my creativity and strategic thinking. Work became a source of satisfaction and identity that no romantic relationship had ever provided. I traveled for business, attended industry conferences, and built professional relationships that enriched my life in ways that my marriage never had. The fertility treatments ended with my divorce, but I felt relief rather than regret about abandoning that particular dream. The idea of raising children with David while competing with Ashley for his attention and involvement had never been appealing once I recognized the actual dynamics of our household. Single motherhood through adoption or sperm donation remained options. If I decided children were essential to my happiness, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my dignity for anyone else's vision of what my life should include. My story wasn't about a cheating husband or a scheming secretary or dramatic confrontations in medical waiting rooms. It was about recognizing when a relationship has fundamentally changed and having the courage to acknowledge that reality rather than living in denial. David and Ashley had built something that worked for them, but it didn't work for me, and pretending otherwise would have diminished all three of us. The divorce taught me that love isn't enough to sustain a marriage when partnership has been replaced by management, and when respect has been eroded by assumptions about what roles each person should accept. David loved me in the abstract way that people love familiar possessions, but he preferred Ashley's active partnership in building the life he actually wanted to live. Choosing divorce wasn't about punishing David or competing with Ash. It was about reclaiming agency over my own life and refusing to accept secondary status in relationships that should have been built on equality and mutual respect. The woman who sat silently in that fertility clinic waiting room while her husband and his secretary planned her medical treatment was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth too clearly to accept anything less than full partnership in whatever relationship she chose to pursue. The news of my divorce spread through Phoenix's professional circles with the kind of controlled discretion that characterizes business communities where everyone knows everyone else's affairs, but discusses them only in carefully measured doses. Within weeks of the papers being filed, I began receiving subtle expressions of support from colleagues, clients, and acquaintances who had apparently noticed dynamics in my marriage that I had been too close to recognize clearly. Maria, my younger sister who worked as a pediatric nurse at Banner Desert Medical Center, was the first family member to admit she had been concerned about David's relationship with Ashley for months. Over dinner at our favorite Mexican restaurant in downtown Phoenix, she revealed that she had witnessed several interactions between David and Ashley that had struck her as inappropriately intimate for a professional relationship. The most telling incident had occurred at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital where Maria worked. David and Ashley had attended together while I was traveling for business, and Maria watched them interact throughout the evening with the ease and coordination of a long-established couple. They shared inside jokes, finished each other's sentences, and moved through the crowd as a unified team in ways that seemed natural and practiced rather than professional. Maria had been particularly disturbed by a moment when Ashley adjusted David's tie before they posed for photographs with other donors. The gesture was brief and casual, but it suggested a level of physical familiarity that extended beyond appropriate workplace boundaries. When Maria mentioned this observation to other family members, they admitted they had noticed similar signs of unusual intimacy between David and Ashley at various social events. The revelation that my own family had been watching my marriage dissolve while I remained oblivious felt humiliating initially, but Maria explained that they had struggled to find ways to address their concerns without seeming intrusive or judgmental. They had hoped I would recognize the problematic dynamics independently and address them before they reached the point of no return. Their silence had been motivated by respect for my privacy rather than indifference to my well-being. Rachel, my best friend since college and the maid of honor at my wedding, had been even more direct in her observations about David's changing behavior over the past year. During our weekly coffee meetings at the Grind Coffee House, she had noticed that David's conversations increasingly centered on Ashley's opinions, insights, and contributions to his work and personal life. Rachel had found it strange that David seemed to know more about Ashley's preferences and perspectives than he did about mine. The shift had been particularly noticeable when David started declining social invitations on behalf of both of us, explaining that Ashley had researched better alternatives or identified scheduling conflicts that would make certain events inconvenient. Rachel found it odd that David was consulting his secretary about our social calendar rather than discussing plans directly with me. She had assumed I was aware of this arrangement and had chosen not to comment, but the pattern had struck her as unusual for a healthy marriage. Rachel also revealed that David had called her several times over the past few months to ask for advice about managing what he described as my emotional volatility during fertility treatment. He had wanted suggestions for supporting me through hormone-related mood swings and disappointment about failed cycles. While Rachel appreciated his concern for my well-being, she had been disturbed by his apparent inability to communicate directly with me about these challenges. Most troubling was David's revelation to Rachel that Ashley had been researching psychological support resources for couples dealing with fertility issues and had compiled information about counseling options that might help us navigate the emotional demands of treatment. The fact that David's secretary was researching therapy options for our marriage while David avoided direct conversations with me about our relationship had struck Rachel as fundamentally backward. These conversations with Maria and Rachel helped me understand that the problems in my marriage had been visible to people who cared about me long before I was ready to acknowledge them myself. The gradual nature of David's emotional transfer from our marriage to his relationship with Ashley had made each individual change seem insignificant, but the cumulative effect had been the systematic replacement of spousal partnership with secretarial management. The professional community's response to my divorce was more complex and revealing than I had anticipated. Several clients of Rodriguez and Associates reached out to express support and to emphasize that their business relationships with my firm were based on my individual capabilities rather than any connection to David's legal practice. Their proactive reassurances suggested they had been aware of potential complications that might arise from the dissolution of my marriage to a prominent attorney. One client, the marketing director for a major real estate development company, mentioned that her organization had been hesitant to refer legal business to David's firm specifically because they had observed Ashley's unusual level of involvement in client communications and decision-making process. They had found it difficult to determine whether they were working with David as their attorney or with Ashley as his representative, and this ambiguity had created concerns about professional accountability and confidence. Another client revealed that industry rumors had been circulating for months about David's inappropriate relationship with his secretary, with speculation about whether their collaboration crossed ethical boundaries that might affect the quality of legal representation. The fact that these concerns had been discussed among potential clients without reaching my awareness demonstrated how isolated I had become from David's professional reputation and its potential impact on my own business relationship. The legal community's response was more nuanced, reflecting the complex dynamics of professional relationships in a city where attorneys frequently collaborate and compete with each other across different practice areas. Mark Sullivan, David's business partner reached out to assure me that the dissolution of my marriage would not affect any collaborative relationships between our respective firms and that he respected my decision to prioritize my personal well-being over maintaining appearance. However, Mark also mentioned that he had been concerned about David's increasing reliance on Ashley for tasks that extended beyond typical secretarial responsibilities, including client consultation and case strategy development. As David's partner, Mark had found himself in the awkward position of supervising an employee whose actual role had evolved far beyond her official job description without formal recognition or appropriate compensation adjustment. Mark revealed that Ashley had been essentially functioning as an associate attorney without the credentials or legal authorization to provide the services she was performing. Her involvement in client meetings, document preparation and strategic planning had created potential liability issues for the firm that Mark had been struggling to address without undermining David's productivity and client relationship. The ethical implications of Ashley's expanded role had become particularly problematic when clients began requesting her direct involvement in their cases, treating her as David's equal partner rather than his support staff. Mark had been forced to implement policies that clarified Ashley's limitations and ensured that clients understood the distinction between David's legal expertise and Ashley's administrative assistance. These revelations about David's professional challenges helped me understand that his relationship with Ashley had created complications that extended far beyond our marriage. His inability to maintain appropriate boundaries in one area of his life had undermined his credibility and effectiveness in other areas, suggesting patterns of judgment and decision-making that would likely continue to create problems regardless of our divorce. The financial aspects of our divorce proved remarkably straightforward, largely because David and I had maintained separate business interests and investment portfolios throughout our marriage. Rodriguez and Associates was entirely my creation and ownership, built through my independent efforts and client relationships that had no connection to David's legal practice. Similarly, David's partnership in Shannon Sullivan Legal Group was his individual achievement, though our divorce would require him to address the complications created by Ashley's inappropriate role in the firm. Jennifer Hayes handled the property division with efficiency that reflected the relatively clean separation of our financial lives. We had purchased our Ahwatukee home together, but my higher income and larger down payment contribution meant that I retained primary ownership while compensating David for his equity stake. The house had never felt like our shared sanctuary anyway, having become more of a hotel where David occasionally slept between work commitments that increasingly involved Ash. Our investment accounts, retirement savings, and personal assets were divided according to individual contributions, rather than assumed spousal equality, which favored my position given the success of my marketing firm relative to David's legal practice. The prenuptial agreement we had signed before marriage protected both of our business interests while ensuring that neither party could claim ownership of enterprises they had not directly developed. David's attorney attempted to argue that Ashley's contributions to his productivity and client satisfaction had enhanced the value of his legal practice in ways that should be considered marital assets subject to division. However, this argument was quickly abandoned when it became clear that pursuing this line of reasoning would require detailed examination of Ashley's actual role and compensation, potentially exposing ethical violations that could damage David's professional standing. The speed and efficiency of our divorce proceedings reflected both parties' desire to avoid prolonged legal battles that would benefit no one except attorney. David seemed to understand that fighting the dissolution would be futile and potentially damaging to his reputation, while I wanted to move forward with my life rather than engaging in vindictive litigation that would consume time and energy. I preferred to invest in my business and personal growth. 6 weeks after filing the initial papers, our divorce was finalized in a brief hearing that felt more like a business transaction than the end of an 8-year marriage. David appeared with his attorney but without Ashley, maintaining professional decorum that suggested he had finally recognized the inappropriate nature of including her in legal proceedings related to our marriage. We spoke only when required by court procedures, exchanging necessary information with the polite distance of former business partners settling a dissolved partnership. Walking out of the Maricopa County Superior Court building as a divorced woman felt surprisingly liberating rather than tragic. The weight of maintaining a marriage that had become irrelevant to my husband's actual life was gone, replaced by the freedom to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than convenience and social expectation. The transition to single life was smoother than I had anticipated, largely because I had been functioning as a single person for months while married to someone whose primary emotional and intellectual connections were with his secretary. My daily routines, professional responsibilities, and social activities required minimal adjustment since David's absence from these areas of my life had been gradual and comprehensive. Rodriguez and Associates benefited from my renewed focus and energy, as I channeled the emotional investment previously wasted on my failing marriage into expanding client relationships and developing innovative marketing strategies. The firm landed 3 major accounts within 2 months of my divorce, projects that required the kind of creative thinking and strategic planning that had been difficult to sustain while managing the stress of a deteriorating marriage. My personal life also improved dramatically once I stopped trying to accommodate David's schedule and preferences. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during the years when David's work commitments dominated our social calendar. I pursued hobbies and interests that David had considered impractical or self-indulgent. I traveled to destinations that appealed to me rather than locations that Ashley had researched and recommended. The freedom to make decisions based solely on my own preferences and priorities was intoxicating after years of deferring to David's judgment, or more accurately, to Ashley's research and recommendations that David presented as his own insight. I rediscovered aspects of my personality that had been suppressed or redirected during my marriage, remembering interests and ambitions that had been set aside to accommodate someone else's vision of what our life together should look like. Dating was not an immediate priority, but the possibility of finding a partner who valued actual partnership over efficient management began to seem appealing rather than daunting. My experience with David had taught me to recognize the difference between love that respects autonomy and love that requires submission, between support that enhances individual growth and support that creates dependence. The social aftermath of my divorce revealed interesting patterns in how different people had perceived my marriage and its dissolution. Some acquaintances expressed surprise at the divorce, having seen David and me as a stable, successful couple whose professional achievements suggested compatibility and mutual support. These individuals had observed only the public performance of our marriage, rather than the private reality of David's emotional unavailability and my increasing isolation. Others admitted they had expected our marriage to end eventually, having noticed signs of fundamental incompatibility that they had assumed we would address through counseling or personal growth. These more observant friends had recognized that David and I were living parallel lives that intersected primarily for social events and practical necessities rather than sharing genuine intimacy or partnership. The most insightful responses came from women who had experienced similar situations in their own relationships, marriages where gradual emotional withdrawal had been disguised as practical efficiency or professional dedication. They understood how difficult it was to recognize the systematic replacement of spousal partnership with external relationships, especially when the transition was managed by someone as competent and seemingly helpful as Ash. These conversations helped me understand that my experience was not unique or particularly dramatic, but rather representative of a common pattern in relationships where one partner gradually transfers their primary emotional investment to someone else while maintaining the appearance of marital stability. The insidious nature of this process makes it difficult to identify and address until the displacement is complete and irreversible. Professional therapy provided additional perspective on the dynamics that had developed in my marriage and the reasons why I had been slow to recognize their significance. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who specialized in relationship transitions, helped me understand that my willingness to accommodate David's increasing reliance on Ashley had been motivated by genuine love and desire to support his professional success rather than by weakness or denial. The gradual nature of David's emotional transfer had made each individual change seem reasonable and temporary, part of a temporary adjustment to increased work demands rather than a permanent reallocation of his primary loyalty. My professional success and personal confidence had actually worked against me in recognizing the problem, since I had been capable of maintaining my own life and responsibilities without requiring constant support from David. Chen explained that many intelligent, accomplished women find themselves in similar situations because their competence and independence make them less likely to demand attention and emotional investment from partners who are gradually withdrawing from the relationship. The very qualities that make these women successful in their careers can make them vulnerable to partners who prefer convenience over genuine partnership. The therapy process also helped me recognize that David's behavior was not necessarily intentionally manipulative or deliberately hurtful, but rather reflected his own confusion about what he wanted from relationships and his inability to distinguish between professional efficiency and personal intimacy. His preference for Ashley's structured support over my more complex emotional needs was not a judgment of my worth, but rather a reflection of his limited capacity for the kind of partnership that healthy marriages require. Understanding the psychological dynamics behind our divorce helped me approach future relationships with clearer boundaries and more realistic expectations about what I needed from romantic partners. The experience taught me to distinguish between support that enhances individual growth and support that creates dependency, between love that respects autonomy and love that requires submission to someone else's management style. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I attended a professional conference in San Diego where I met Jonathan Rodriguez, a successful architect who owned his own firm specializing in sustainable commercial design. Our initial conversation focused on potential collaboration opportunities between our respective businesses, but the discussion revealed shared values and perspectives that extended beyond professional interest. Jonathan was recently divorced himself, having ended a marriage where his ex-wife had gradually lost interest in his career and personal growth, while becoming increasingly focused on social status and material acquisition. His experience with emotional withdrawal and fundamental incompatibility had taught him to value authentic connection over convenient arrangements, making him an ideal partner for someone who had learned similar lessons through her own relationship failure. Our relationship developed slowly and deliberately, with both of us committed to maintaining our individual identities and professional responsibilities while exploring the possibility of genuine partnership. Jonathan understood the importance of mutual respect and shared decision-making in ways that David had never grasped, treating my opinions and preferences as valuable inputs rather than obstacles to efficient management. The contrast between Jonathan's approach to relationships and David's management style was striking and educational. Jonathan asked for my thoughts and feelings about decisions that affected both of us, rather than researching options and presenting conclusions for my approval. He respected my expertise in areas where I had more knowledge and experience, rather than deferring to external advisors who might provide more convenient perspectives. Most importantly, Jonathan was capable of maintaining appropriate boundaries between his professional relationships and our personal partnership. His assistant was a 50-year-old man named Robert who handled scheduling and administrative tasks with professional competence, but without inserting himself into Jonathan's personal life or our relationship decisions. The clear distinction between professional support and personal intimacy felt refreshing after years of watching David blur these boundaries with Ashley. The relationship with Jonathan progressed naturally toward deeper commitment and shared planning for the future, but not because either of us needed rescue or completion from the other person. Instead, our partnership enhanced individual strengths and provided mutual support for personal and professional growth that we were both pursuing independently. 1 year after my divorce, David and Ashley's engagement was announced in the Phoenix Business Journal, along with news that Ashley had been promoted to associate attorney at Chen & Sullivan Legal Group after completing her law degree through an accelerated evening program. The announcement presented their relationship as a natural progression of professional collaboration into personal partnership, avoiding any mention of the timeline that had overlapped with David's marriage to me. The news felt like final confirmation that David and Ashley had found the arrangement that worked best for their shared values and priorities. They had built a relationship based on professional efficiency and mutual advancement rather than the kind of personal intimacy and emotional vulnerability that I had expected from marriage. Their success together validated my decision to end a marriage that had never provided what any of us actually needed: My response to their engagement was genuine happiness rather than resentment or regret. David had found someone who shared his preference for structured collaboration over spontaneous connection, while I had discovered the freedom to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenient arrangement. Ashley had achieved the professional advancement and personal security she had been seeking, while I had escaped a marriage that diminished my autonomy and self-respect. The resolution felt satisfying in its completeness, with everyone finding situations that better matched their actual desires and capabilities. There were no villains in this story, only people who had been trying to force incompatible approaches to relationships and life into arrangements that couldn't sustain the differences long term. Rodriguez and Associates continued to grow and thrive, expanding into new markets and developing innovative approaches to digital marketing that attracted clients from across the South. My professional success felt more meaningful now that it was pursued for its own sake rather than as compensation for personal disappointments or as proof of worth to someone who valued different qualities entirely. The business relationships I developed with other entrepreneurs and professionals felt more authentic and mutually beneficial than the social connections I had maintained during my marriage. When so many interactions were filtered through David's preferences and Ashley's research about appropriate networking strategy, building professional relationships based on my own judgment and instincts proved more effective and satisfying than following someone else's systematic approach to social advancement. Personal relationships also became more genuine and meaningful once I stopped trying to accommodate expectations that didn't align with my actual values and priorities. Friendships with people who appreciated my authentic personality rather than my ability to support someone else's success provided the kind of emotional satisfaction that had been missing from my marriage for years. The story of my divorce became a cautionary tale that other women shared when discussing their own relationship challenges, not because my experience was particularly dramatic or tragic, but because it illustrated how easily intelligent, successful people can find themselves in situations that undermine their dignity and autonomy through gradual erosion rather than obvious betrayal. Many women recognized aspects of their own relationships in my description of how David had gradually transferred his primary emotional investment to Ashley while expecting me to remain satisfied with secondary status. The insidious nature of this process, disguised as practical efficiency and professional support, made it difficult to identify and address until the displacement was complete and irreversible. My experience also resonated with people who had struggled to maintain their individual identities while accommodating partners who preferred management over partnership, structure over spontaneity, and external validation over internal connection. The relief of ending relationships that required constant self-diminishment in service of someone else's comfort became a common theme in these conversations. The lessons learned through my divorce extended beyond romantic relationships to influence how I approached business partnerships, friendships, and family dynamics. I became more sensitive to situations where my contributions were taken for granted or where my autonomy was gradually eroded through seemingly reasonable requests for accommodation and compromise. The experience taught me to distinguish between healthy interdependence that enhances individual growth and unhealthy dependency that requires constant self-sacrifice for someone else's convenience. Learning to recognize these patterns early in relationships prevented me from repeating the mistakes that had made my marriage unsustainable. 2 years after my divorce, I could honestly say that ending my marriage to David was one of the best decisions I had ever made. Not because I was vindictive or angry about what had happened, but because it had freed me to build a life based on my own values and priorities, rather than trying to accommodate someone else's vision of what our relationship should provide. The woman who had sat silently in that fertility clinic waiting room while her husband and his secretary planned her medical treatment was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth too clearly to accept anything less than full partnership in whatever relationship she chose to pursue. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and entirely worth the temporary pain of acknowledging that my marriage had already ended long before I filed the legal papers that made the dissolution official. The attempted reconciliation began with a series of seemingly innocent encounters that I initially dismissed as coincidental but gradually recognized as deliberately orchestrated. 3 months after our divorce was finalized, David started appearing at locations where he knew I would be conducting business or meeting with clients.
His presence at these events wasn't entirely surprising given that Phoenix's professional community was relatively small and interconnected, but the frequency and timing of these appearances suggested intentional planning rather than random occurrence.
The first encounter happened at Seasons Bistro during a lunch meeting with potential clients from a luxury resort development company. I was halfway through my presentation about their upcoming marketing campaign when David walked in with Ashley, requesting a table for two. The hostess seated them directly within my line of sight, and throughout my meeting, I was acutely aware of David glancing in my direction while maintaining animated conversation with Ashley about what appeared to be business matters. When my clients excused themselves to take a phone call, David approached my table with a casual smile that seemed forced and unnatural. He greeted me warmly, asking about my business and expressing surprise at seeing me at one of our former favorite restaurants. His manner was friendly but carried an undercurrent of familiarity that felt inappropriate, given our recent divorce and the circumstances that had led to it. David mentioned that he and Ashley were celebrating the successful conclusion of a major real estate transaction, emphasizing how well they worked together and how Ashley's contributions had been essential to achieving their clients' objectives. His comments seemed designed to demonstrate their professional partnership, while subtly suggesting that their relationship had evolved naturally from workplace collaboration, rather than being the cause of our marriage's failure. When my clients returned to the table, David lingered long enough to observe their expensive clothing and confident demeanor, clearly assessing the caliber of business Rodriguez and Associates was attracting. His evaluation felt intrusive and possessive, as if he retained some ownership interest in my professional success, despite our complete legal and financial separation. Ashley remained at their table during this interaction, watching our conversation with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was monitoring the exchange for information rather than simply waiting for David to return. Her scrutiny felt uncomfortable and inappropriate, given that she had no legitimate interest in my business relationships or personal well-being beyond whatever curiosity David's comments might have generated. The second encounter occurred at a professional networking event sponsored by the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce, where I was representing Rodriguez and Associates among other local business owners. David arrived with Ashley shortly after I had begun circulating among attendees, introducing them as his associate and business partner rather than identifying Ashley's actual role as his secretary or the personal nature of their relationship. Throughout the evening, David positioned himself to overhear my conversations with potential clients and business partners, inserting himself into discussions where his legal expertise might be relevant while subtly steering conversations toward topics that showcased Ashley's knowledge and capability. His behavior felt like an attempt to demonstrate their professional value while gathering intelligence about my current business activities and future plans. The most unsettling aspect of this encounter was David's attempt to reframe our divorce as a mutual decision that had strengthened both of our careers, by allowing us to focus on our individual professional goals without the complications of managing a dual career marriage. His explanation made our separation sound like a strategic business decision rather than the result of his emotional infidelity and boundary violations with Ashley. Several attendees who knew about our divorce seemed uncomfortable with David's revisionist narrative, particularly when he suggested that our marriage had been more of a practical partnership than a romantic relationship. His comments felt like an attempt to minimize the significance of our 8-year marriage while justifying his current relationship with Ashley as a natural progression rather than an ethical violation. The third encounter was the most blatant and concerning, occurring at the Grind Coffee House, where I had been meeting regularly with Rachel for our weekly catch-up session. David appeared alone this time, ordering coffee and selecting a table near ours despite numerous other seating options being available throughout the cafe. He spent the first 20 minutes working on his laptop and taking phone calls, creating the impression of someone conducting normal business activities rather than deliberately positioning himself to monitor my personal conversation. However, his attention repeatedly shifted to our table whenever Rachel and I discussed topics related to my business growth, travel plans, or developing relationship with Jonathan. When Rachel excused herself to take a call outside, David immediately approached my table with coffee in hand, asking if he could sit down for a brief conversation. His demeanor was serious and concerned rather than casually friendly, suggesting that this encounter had been planned specifically to create an opportunity for private discussion. David began by expressing regret about how our marriage had ended, emphasizing that he had never intended to hurt me or damage our relationship through his professional collaboration with Ashley. He described their working relationship as having evolved gradually beyond normal boundaries without either of them recognizing the inappropriate nature of their increasing intimacy until it was too late to reverse course without devastating consequence. His explanation felt like a carefully rehearsed attempt to recharacterize his emotional infidelity as an unfortunate misunderstanding, rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize Ashley's partnership over our marriage. David seemed to genuinely believe that good intentions and professional necessity excused the boundary violations that had systematically undermined our relationship over many months. David then surprised me by suggesting that our divorce had been premature and possibly unnecessary, arguing that couples counseling or a temporary separation might have addressed the problems that led to our marriage's dissolution. He proposed that we consider reconciliation now that he had gained perspective on the mistakes he had made and the value of what we had shared together. His reconciliation proposal was accompanied by criticism of Ashley that felt both strategic and vindictive. David mentioned that working closely with Ashley had revealed personality traits and professional limitations that had not been apparent during the earlier stages of their collaboration. He described her as overly controlling, professionally ambitious in ways that conflicted with his leadership style, and emotionally demanding in ways that made their relationship more complicated than he had anticipated. These revelations about Ashley's character flaws seemed designed to contrast with David's apparent newfound appreciation for my independence, professional competence, and emotional stability. He emphasized how much he missed the ease and compatibility we had shared before outside pressures and misunderstandings had damaged our connection. David's reconciliation pitch included specific examples of how our life together had been better than his current situation with Ash. He missed my cooking, my sense of humor, my family relationships, and my ability to maintain our social connections without requiring constant management and coordination. He described feeling exhausted by the effort required to sustain his relationship with Ashley compared to the natural compatibility he remembered sharing with me. The conversation felt manipulative and self-serving rather than genuinely remorseful or reflective. David's criticisms of Ashley seemed designed to flatter me by comparison rather than representing authentic insights about his relationship choices. His apparent regret about our divorce appeared motivated more by dissatisfaction with his current situation than by genuine recognition of the value he had lost when our marriage ended. When Rachel returned from her phone call, she immediately sensed the tension at our table and politely but firmly suggested that David should leave us to continue our private conversation. Her intervention provided a graceful exit from an uncomfortable situation, but David's parting comments indicated that he intended to pursue further opportunities for reconciliation discussion. Over the following weeks, David's attempts to reconnect intensified through a variety of channels that demonstrated both persistence and poor judgment about appropriate post-divorce boundaries. He began calling my office under the pretense of discussing potential referral opportunities between our respective businesses, conversations that inevitably shifted toward personal topics and expressions of regret about our separation. These professional calls were handled by my assistant, who reported that David frequently asked about my schedule, travel plans, and current projects in ways that seemed to exceed legitimate business interests. His inquiries felt like surveillance rather than genuine concern for my well-being or professional success. David also started sending text messages on holidays and special occasions, initially maintaining appropriate boundaries by focusing on general well wishes, but gradually becoming more personal and nostalgic. His messages referenced shared memories from our marriage, mutual friends who missed seeing us together, and his growing recognition of mistakes he had made during our relationship. The most inappropriate contact came through social media, where David began commenting on posts related to Rodriguez and Associates' business achievements and my professional accomplishments. His comments were publicly supportive and congratulatory, but they created the impression of ongoing connection and mutual interest, that felt misleading given the actual state of our relationship. These social media interactions were particularly problematic because they were visible to my current clients, potential business partners, and Jonathan, who was understandably concerned about David's apparent inability to respect the boundaries that divorce should have established. The public nature of David's comments made it difficult to address his behavior privately without creating additional drama or drawing unwanted attention to our personal history. The situation escalated when David began appearing at business events and social gatherings where he knew Jonathan would be present, apparently attempting to assess his replacement and potentially undermine our developing relationship. His behavior at these events was superficially polite and professional, but his presence felt threatening and possessive in ways that made both Jonathan and me uncomfortable. During one particularly awkward encounter at a charity fundraiser for the Phoenix Art Museum, David spent considerable time engaging Jonathan in conversation about architecture, sustainable design, and business management. His questions were probing and slightly aggressive, designed to evaluate Jonathan's professional competence and personal character rather than express genuine interest in his work. David also made several comments to mutual acquaintances at the event about his surprise at seeing me with someone new so soon after our divorce, suggesting that I had moved on quickly from our 8-year marriage in ways that seemed emotionally superficial or possibly vindictive. His characterization of my relationship with Jonathan as a rebound or revenge situation felt designed to undermine its legitimacy and seriousness. The most disturbing aspect of David's behavior at this event was his attempt to share intimate details about our marriage with people who had known us as a couple, apparently trying to generate sympathy for his position as the abandoned husband, while painting me as emotionally unstable or unreliable in relationships. His violation of our privacy felt like a deliberate attempt to damage my reputation within our shared social circle. Jonathan handled David's provocations with remarkable composure and dignity, refusing to engage in competition or defensiveness, while making it clear that he respected my autonomy and judgment about past relationships. His mature response highlighted the contrast between healthy partnership and the possessive control that David seemed to consider normal in romantic relationships. After this event, I decided that David's behavior had crossed the line from inappropriate nostalgia into harassment that required direct confrontation. I arranged to meet him at his office, bringing Jennifer Hayes as my attorney to ensure that our conversation remained professional and legally appropriate. The meeting took place in the conference room at Chen & Sullivan Legal Group, with Mark Sullivan present as David's partner and potential witness to whatever agreements we might reach about future contact. Ashley was notably absent from this discussion, suggesting that David had finally recognized the inappropriateness of including her in conversations about our post-divorce relationship. Jennifer opened the meeting by outlining the pattern of unwanted contact that David had initiated since our divorce, emphasizing how his behavior was affecting my professional relationships and personal well-being. She presented documentation of his phone calls, text messages, social media interactions, and public appearances that demonstrated a clear pattern of boundary violation. David's initial response was defensive and self-justifying, arguing that his attempts to reconnect were motivated by genuine love and regret rather than harassment or manipulation. He insisted that reaching out to an ex-spouse was normal behavior that didn't constitute stalking or intimidation, especially given the amicable nature of our divorce proceeding. Mark Sullivan intervened to point out that David's behavior was creating potential liability issues for their law firm, particularly if clients or professional colleagues perceived his actions as unstable or inappropriate. As David's business partner, Mark was concerned about the impact of personal drama on their professional reputation and client relationship. Jennifer then presented a formal cease and desist letter that prohibited David from initiating any contact with me outside of legitimate business necessities, attending events where he knew I would be present without prior notification, or discussing our marriage or divorce with mutual acquaintances or professional colleagues. The letter outlined specific consequences for violations, including potential restraining orders and harassment charges. David's reaction to the cease and desist letter revealed the depth of his sense of entitlement and his inability to accept responsibility for the boundary violations that had characterized both our marriage and his post-divorce behavior. He seemed genuinely shocked that I would resort to legal action to prevent contact from someone who claimed to love me and want reconciliation. His shock suggested that David had never understood the fundamental difference between love that respects autonomy and love that demands submission to someone else's needs and preferences. His inability to recognize why I might want to avoid contact with someone who had systematically replaced me with his secretary indicated a profound lack of emotional intelligence and self-awareness. The meeting concluded with David reluctantly agreeing to respect the boundaries outlined in the cease and desist letter, though his compliance seemed motivated more by concern for his professional reputation than by genuine understanding of why his behavior was inappropriate. Mark Sullivan assured Jennifer that he would monitor David's adherence to the agreement and intervene if necessary to protect the firm's interest. Walking out of Chen and Sullivan Legal Group after that meeting felt like closing a door that should have been shut months earlier. David's attempts at reconciliation had been based on his dissatisfaction with Ashley, rather than genuine appreciation for what I had brought to our marriage, making his overtures feel insulting rather than flattering. The contrast between David's possessive desperation and Jonathan's respectful partnership became even more apparent in the weeks following the cease and desist meeting. Jonathan had never attempted to control my schedule, monitor my business relationships, or insert himself into situations where he wasn't specifically invited. His confidence in our relationship was based on mutual choice rather than legal obligation or social pressure. David's behavior during the attempted reconciliation had actually strengthened my conviction that divorcing him was the right decision. His inability to respect boundaries, his tendency to manipulate situations for his own benefit, and his fundamental misunderstanding of what healthy relationships require had not changed despite his apparent regret about losing our marriage. The reconciliation attempt also revealed that David's relationship with Ashley was experiencing the same problems that had plagued our marriage, suggesting that his issues with partnership and boundaries were personal characteristics rather than situational responses to our specific incompatibility. His criticism of Ashley's controlling behavior and professional ambitions indicated that he was uncomfortable with any partner who maintained independent goals and opinions. 6 months after the cease and desist meeting, I learned through mutual acquaintances that David and Ashley's engagement had been postponed indefinitely due to what were diplomatically described as professional disagreements and personal incompatibility. Their working relationship had apparently become strained by the same boundary issues that had undermined my marriage to David. Ashley had reportedly grown frustrated with David's tendency to make unilateral decisions about cases they were supposed to be handling collaboratively, while David had become irritated by Ashley's attempts to assert equal authority in client relationships and business development. Their conflict suggested that neither of them had learned to distinguish between professional collaboration and personal partnership. The news of their relationship troubles felt like vindication of my decision to end our marriage, rather than attempting to compete with Ashley for David's attention and commitment. Both Ashley and I had discovered that David's preferred relationship style was management rather than partnership, control rather than collaboration, and efficiency rather than intimacy. Rodriguez and Associates continued to thrive during this period, benefiting from my renewed focus and the strategic insights that Jonathan brought to our business discussion. His background in sustainable architecture provided valuable perspectives on long-term planning and environmental responsibility that enhanced our marketing approaches for clients in construction, development, and related industries. The relationship with Jonathan had evolved into a true partnership that enhanced both of our individual capabilities while maintaining our separate professional identities and personal autonomy. We collaborated on projects that benefited from our combined expertise, while respecting each other's independent decision-making authority in our respective business. Most importantly, Jonathan understood that healthy relationships require ongoing choice rather than legal obligation or social pressure. His commitment to our partnership was demonstrated through daily actions and decisions, rather than grand gestures or dramatic declarations,
creating the kind of stable foundation that had been missing from my marriage to David. The attempted reconciliation period had taught me valuable lessons about recognizing and responding to manipulation, disguised as love, understanding the difference between genuine remorse and strategic regret, and maintaining boundaries with people who had demonstrated their inability to respect autonomy and independence in relationships. These lessons extended beyond romantic relationships to influence how I approached business partnerships, client relationships, and friendship. The experience of having my boundaries systematically violated during marriage, and then threatened again during David's reconciliation attempts, had sharpened my ability to identify and address similar patterns before they could cause significant damage. The woman who had once sat silently while her husband and his secretary planned her medical treatment had been replaced by someone who understood her own worth too clearly to tolerate manipulation, control, or disrespect from anyone, regardless of their claimed motivations or declared love. The transformation was complete, permanent, and entirely worth the temporary discomfort of enforcing boundaries that should have been obvious to anyone capable of genuine partnership. David's failed reconciliation attempt became the final chapter in our relationship, demonstrating conclusively that his regret about our divorce was motivated by dissatisfaction with his current situation, rather than genuine appreciation for what he had lost. His inability to accept responsibility for the choices that had ended our marriage, combined with his continued attempts to control situations for his own benefit, confirmed that ending our relationship had been the right decision for both of us. The experience also highlighted the importance of having strong support systems and legal resources when dealing with people who cannot accept the boundaries that healthy relationships require. Jennifer's assistance with the cease and desist letter, Jonathan's respectful response to David's provocations, and the support of friends and family had made it possible to address David's inappropriate behavior without compromising my professional reputation or personal well-being. Looking back on the attempted reconciliation, I felt grateful that David's true character had been revealed so clearly and quickly, preventing me from making the mistake of giving him another opportunity to undermine my autonomy and self-respect. His behavior during this period had eliminated any lingering doubts about whether our marriage might have been salvaged through counseling or compromise. The final resolution of David's reconciliation attempts left me free to focus entirely on building a future based on genuine partnership, mutual respect, and shared values, rather than trying to manage someone else's inability to function in healthy relationships. The door to the past was finally closed and locked, with no possibility of reopening regardless of whatever regrets or second thoughts David might experience in the future. 2 years had passed since the cease and desist order effectively ended David's intrusion into my new life, and the transformation felt complete in ways I hadn't expected. Rodriguez and Associates had expanded beyond my wildest projections, with offices now in Tucson and Flagstaff, serving clients throughout Arizona and New Mexico. The business success felt particularly sweet because it was built entirely on my own vision and capabilities, without any connection to David's legal network or professional reputation. Jonathan and I had moved in together 6 months earlier, purchasing a stunning contemporary home in Paradise Valley that reflected both of our aesthetic preferences and professional success. The house featured Jonathan's architectural sensibilities in its clean lines and sustainable design elements, while my marketing expertise had influenced the selection of art and furnishings that created warmth without sacrificing sophistication. Living together had revealed the profound difference between genuine partnership and the management-style relationship I had endured with David. Jonathan consulted me about decisions that affected our shared space and future plans, but he never attempted to control or redirect my individual choices about career, friendships, or personal interests. We enhanced each other's lives without diminishing our separate identity. The engagement ring Jonathan designed for me was a custom creation that reflected his understanding of my personality and preferences, rather than his assumptions about what engagement rings should look like. The process of creating something unique together felt symbolic of how we approached all aspects of our relationship, building solutions that worked for us specifically, rather than following conventional expectations about how couples should function. Planning our wedding became an exercise in genuine collaboration, with both families contributing ideas and resources, while respecting our autonomy as the primary decision makers. The contrast with my experience planning the wedding with David was striking. Instead of one person making unilateral decisions while the other accommodated or deferred, Jonathan and I negotiated differences through discussion and compromise that left both of us satisfied with the final choices. The guest list for our wedding notably excluded David and Ashley, despite the fact that some mutual acquaintances had suggested their presence might demonstrate mature acceptance of our divorce and respective new relationship. Jonathan and I agreed that our wedding day should focus entirely on celebrating our commitment to each other, rather than managing potentially awkward social dynamics with people from my past. 3 months before our wedding, I encountered David one final time at a restaurant in Scottsdale, where Jonathan and I were celebrating the completion of a major project that had required collaboration between our two companies. David was dining alone at a corner table, looking older and more tired than I remembered, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that seemed almost defeated. He approached our table during dessert, greeting us both with polite formality that suggested he had finally learned to respect appropriate boundaries. His congratulations on our engagement were brief and apparently sincere, without any of the possessiveness or manipulation that had characterized his previous attempts to reconnect. He looked like someone who had genuinely accepted the finality of our divorce and the irrelevance of his regret. David mentioned that he and Ashley had ended their relationship several months earlier, and that he was considering relocating to Denver, where a former law school colleague had offered him a partnership in an established firm. His plans for leaving Phoenix felt like a final acknowledgement that his attempts to rebuild his life here had been unsuccessful, possibly because too many professional relationships had been damaged by his poor judgment during our marriage and divorce. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, ending when David wished us happiness in our marriage and excused himself from the restaurant. His departure felt like the conclusion of a chapter that had already been closed, providing unnecessary but somehow satisfying confirmation that our paths had permanently diverged toward destinations that suited our respective characters and priorities. Jonathan's response to this encounter demonstrated exactly why our relationship worked, where my marriage to David had failed. He didn't interrogate me about my feelings or try to manage my emotional response to seeing my ex-husband. He simply asked if I was comfortable continuing our celebration, or if I preferred to leave, trusting my judgment about what I needed while offering support without assuming control. The wedding took place 6 months later in the sculpture garden at the Phoenix Art Museum, surrounded by 150 family members and friends, who had supported our individual journeys and celebrated our decision to build a life together. The ceremony was personal and meaningful rather than elaborate or performative, reflecting our shared values about authenticity and substance over appearance and social expectation. My vows to Jonathan focused on the gratitude I felt for finding someone who understood that love should enhance rather than diminish individual identity, who valued partnership over management, and who was capable of building intimacy based on respect rather than control. His vows expressed similar appreciation for our mutual independence and commitment to supporting each other's growth, without sacrificing personal autonomy. The reception featured toasts from family and friends who had witnessed my transformation from the woman who had accepted secondary status in her own marriage to someone who understood her worth too clearly to settle for anything less than genuine partnership.
Their words felt like celebration not just of our wedding, but of the journey that had led me to recognize what healthy relationships actually require. Maria's toast as my maid of honor referenced the strength it had taken to end a marriage that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty on the inside, and the wisdom required to build something better rather than simply accepting what was convenient or familiar. Her words captured the pride I felt in choosing growth over comfort, authenticity over appearance, and partnership over mere companionship. Rodriguez and Associates continued to thrive in the years following our marriage, with Jonathan's architectural firm becoming a frequent collaborator on projects that required integrated design and marketing expertise. Our professional relationship enhanced our personal partnership without creating the boundary confusion that had characterized David's relationship with Ashley. The fertility dreams I had pursued during my marriage to David eventually became reality through a different path entirely. Jonathan and I adopted 2 siblings, 8-year-old Maya and 6-year-old Carlos, whose previous family situation had required intervention from Child Protective Services. The adoption process was complex and emotionally demanding, but it created the family we both wanted while providing children with the stable home they needed. Raising Maya and Carlos taught me that the love and partnership required for successful parenting had nothing to do with the clinical efficiency that David and Ashley had brought to managing my fertility treatment. Children needed emotional availability, consistent presence, and genuine attention rather than organized schedules and researched strategies. Jonathan's natural warmth and patience with the children confirmed that I had chosen the right partner for building the family life I had always wanted. The story of my divorce became something I shared selectively with other women who found themselves in similar situations, not as drama or entertainment, but as evidence that it was possible to recognize unhealthy relationship patterns and choose something better regardless of how much time and energy had already been invested in arrangements that weren't working. The most important lesson I learned through the entire experience was that genuine love requires the courage to choose authenticity over convenience, partnership over management, and personal growth over comfortable stagnation. The woman who had sat silently in that fertility clinic waiting room while her husband and his secretary planned her medical treatment was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that respect was not negotiable and partnership was not optional in relationships worth maintaining. 5 years after my divorce, I could honestly say that David had done me a favor by choosing Ashley over our marriage. His choice had forced me to recognize my own worth and build a life based on genuine partnership rather than convenient accommodation. The pain of discovering his emotional infidelity had been temporary, but the strength gained through choosing myself over a relationship that diminished my dignity had become permanent and transformative. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.